This is the Mediterranean today. But it's pretty recent. Just 6 million years ago, it was dry. Then a mega flood burst through the mountains and filled it in a matter not of millions of years, but months. Why was the Mediterranean dry? What did it look like? What caused that mega flood? Why was it so brutal? How did it feel to those living there? Was this the famous mega flood that appears across so many religions? How would we know?
Hi, I'm Tomás Puello and welcome to my channel where we go deep in unraveling how the world works today to navigate the world of tomorrow.
First, we need to understand why was the Mediterranean even dry? Millions of years ago, the Mediterranean was part of a huge ocean called Tethys, which is here the right in the middle of Pangaea. And over the hundreds of millions of years ago, that ocean started closing, and remnants of that became the Mediterranean Sea. And so around 40 million years ago or so, the Mediterranean Sea was finally formed. And you can see how the Mediterranean formed by closing the Tethys Ocean because the African plate is pushing into the Eurasian plate. When this happens, you usually have one that falls slightly below the other and mountains formed. Except in the case of the African plate and the Eurasian plate, they grabbed a piece of the Tethys Ocean in the middle, and so you end up having a deep sea there. And as the African plate is subducting below the Eurasian plate, you end up having trenches in the middle of the sea. And all of these you can see here in the topography of Europe. As the African plate hits the Eurasian plate, all these mountains form. And that's why only Southern Europe is mountainous, whereas Northern Europe is very flat. And you can see the same thing when you go underwater. You can see here that there's actually trenches in the Mediterranean Sea. These are more than 1,000 meters deep. And you see them on the coasts of Europe, not of Africa, because Africa is the one subducting below Eurasia. And so what happened? Well, as Africa was hitting Europe, at the beginning, all of this was open. As the African plate was getting closer and closer to the Eurasian plate, it started closing down the Mediterranean Sea until eventually it closes. And at that point, it doesn't have any more water from the ocean, so it starts drying up and up and up. And this is what we called the Messinian salinity crisis. And we're going to understand why in a moment. How do we know this happened? Well, for a couple of reasons. First is the seafloor topography, the bottom of the sea, the shape that the bottom of the sea has. And look at this. If you zoom in, what you can see at the bottom of the sea is rivers, riverbeds. How is this possible? Well, riverbeds don't form in the sea because rivers mix with seawater and they cannot carve a riverbed. The only time when this is possible is when the seabed was above the water. And so now we know that at some point the Mediterranean in these areas was exposed. And the biggest of these underwater rivers is at the Strait of Gibraltar. Now, if you zoom into this area here, you can see a path of very, very powerful rivers. There are papers that have analyzed the behavior of water and soil, and they have concluded that the only way this erosion has been possible in the Strait of Gibraltar is with a mega flood. The other reason why we know that this happened is because of the seafloor salt. Now, you might have heard about the Dead Sea and how much salt it has. That is because the Dead Sea is closed from the ocean. Water doesn't get in from the ocean. And so it dries up and dries up and dries up, and salt concentrates so much that you can see it. The same behavior has been seen at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. Here in this map, you can see the green areas below the sea are areas where the high concentration of carbonates and sulfates which leads us to think that there was a lot of water at some point here and it dried up. And here the red areas are the halite, and this is just rock salt. In fact, the bottom of the Mediterranean has kilometers and kilometers of rock salt. Here, for example, you can see in this Mycenaean mine, it's all made of salt. There's enough salt here to last for all of mankind. It's so big, there's so much salt that miners have created here a chapel. And so you can imagine what happened here when the Mediterranean closed, it dried up, it became so salty that nothing could survive, and all the fish, of course, died. And this is what the Mediterranean ended looking like. Until the megaflood happened. So imagine, the Mediterranean has not received seawater for close to 1 million years, but it's much lower than the rest of the sea. And so what happens is these big mountains between Africa and Spain are stopping the Atlantic Ocean from rushing in. But at some point, so much of this water has been flowing little by little that it has been carving out the mountain. And suddenly, boom, everything explodes. The mountain collapses and water starts rushing in at an unexplicable speed. And if you don't think that can happen, you need to understand this video here. This is a real experiment of what happens when a dam breaks. At the beginning, water flows slowly. But look, as it flows, it takes sediment with it. The more sediment it takes, the more it opens up. The more the hole opens, the more water rushes in, and the faster it goes. The faster it goes, and the more water rushes in, the more sediment it takes. The bigger the hole, the faster the water. The faster the water, the more sediment it takes. The more sediment it takes, the bigger the hole. Bigger hole, faster water, more sediments. Bigger hole, faster water, more sediments. Bigger hole, faster water, more sediments. Faster and faster and faster and faster and faster and faster until boom, it just collapses. And as the Strait of Gibraltar collapses, water rushes in and it fills this part of the Mediterranean within 2 weeks. Look at how this fast goes. This is what it would have looked like from the seafloor. In just 2 days, this was not a matter of millions of years or even years. It wasn't even months. The western part of the Mediterranean filled in 2 weeks. What would it have felt like? Well, look at this. This is the speed of such a flood. Look at the speed of this water rushing in. And you can compare it here to the size and the speed of this caravan. And look at how huge this was. How fast. Imagine that you and your tribe of animals had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. And suddenly, bam, you have this mega flood rushing in, and you try to avoid it, and you try to run as fast as you can to high level, but you can't because you're not fast enough. So you and everybody you know drowns. Only the ones lucky enough to live in what would have become an island afterwards survived. But hold on, let's look at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea here again. This is what we called a bathymetry map, right? It shows the detail of the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. And here in the middle, what is that? Well, there's a bridge in the middle of the Mediterranean between Italy and Africa. And all the water here is actually super shallow. And so as a result, this area was completely dry and it stopped the water from the first mega flood. At the beginning, you had the western part here on the left of the Mediterranean that filled, but not the eastern part. And here's what happens. The water accumulates more and more and more and more, but this ridge here at this level of the Mediterranean is stopping the water until the water finds a way in the Noto Canyon. And one of the biggest floods ever seen in humanity happens. This was a waterfall 1.5 kilometers high, and it excavated a 5-kilometer wide canyon and deposited sediments up to 150 kilometers away. This is how brutal this was in what we call today the Noto Canyon. And how do we know this happened? Because we've seen it in the Noto Canyon. You can see it yourself in Google Maps. Here, it's in this area. And so what happened is that the water rushed in exploded the Noto Canyon, created one of the biggest waterfalls the world has ever seen, and left behind a massive buried flood deposit. And this is what the Noto Canyon looks like today. And this is what we call the Zenan MEGAFLOOD. It flooded the western part of the Mediterranean in just 2 weeks, and the entire Mediterranean, not in millions of years, but in months, about 18 months in total. Now you might be wondering, is this the famous biblical megaflood? And of course it's not, because this happened 5 million years ago, whereas the Bible and similar stories of megafloods were only created a few thousands of years ago. So is there a part of the world that had a megaflood just a few thousand years ago? And here, the biggest candidate that people use is the Black Sea. Here, you can see it yourself. If you go to Google Earth, you're going to see something very similar to what we saw before. Look at this, undersea rivers. What this is telling you is that in this part, there was always water, but this part here was exposed. And that's how we know, because that's the only way that rivers can carve these riverbeds. So in fact, this happened just a few thousand years ago. In the last glaciation period, there was substantial more ice here in the poles and in Northern America and Northern Europe, so the sea level was 120 meters below what it is today. So we do know that the Black Sea filled only in the last few thousands of years. Could it have flooded in a megaflood? Well, it's unlikely, because look, this is the Bosphorus. This is the connection between the Marmara Sea here and the Black Sea here. And what you can see here is that it's not very rugged. Compare this to the Strait of Gibraltar here. This is 13 kilometers wide. It's huge. Why? Because you had all this water that completely destroyed it. But if you can compare this, here the Bosphorus is actually super narrow. It's not at all like the Strait of Gibraltar, which suggests that there was no megaflood. Not only this, but actually you can barely see here any riverbed. And if there had been a megaflood, there would be a riverbed here in the bottom of the sea. We just cannot see it. In fact, we're not even sure that water flowed from the Mediterranean and the Marmara Sea into the Black Sea. Today, we believe that the reverse happened. It was the Black Sea that first started giving water to the Mediterranean. So it's unlikely that when the Black Sea filled just a few thousands of years ago, it happened in a megaflood that would justify the stories of the Bible. Nevertheless, it's not a coincidence that these megaflood stories happen across religions across the world. And I explore this in my newsletter, so if you want to learn more, sign up at tomaspuello.com.